This and the following 3 lectures will introduce the field of Near Eastern Archaeobotany to you. Near Eastern Archaeobotany represents a major and diverse research field, and we will spend therefore some time to consider the different research topics of this unit. Research topics in Near Eastern Archaeobotany are, among others, subsistence strategies of Pleistocene humans, the emergence of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, plant production in Near Eastern civilizations of the Bronze and Iron Ages, and societal collapse in relation with climatic fluctuations. We will treat these topics in the following 4 lectures and in the upcoming presentations. The first lecture is on the general environmental layout of the Near East and some of the better-known climatic and environmental fluctuations during the Holocene. We will also have a very short glimpse on Pleistocene plant use by humans. The second lecture will focus on the emergence of agriculture and the research history and development of this topic throughout time. In the third lecture, we will have a closer look on the particular plant species and their evolutionary history in the process of domestication. The last of these 4 lectures will be on established agricultural societies, in particular of the Bronze and Iron Age Near East, and also include the contribution of stable isotopes to our understanding of ancient agriculture. So let's start with an insight into the environmental conditions and past dynamics of this vast geographic region. The Near East is a politically and geographically very variable region. In archaeology, we consider the term Near East to represent countries of Southwest Asia between the Mediterranean and Iran. The coastal western Anatolian region is usually attributed to the Aegean. The different Near Eastern landscapes are highly diverse, which led to completely different environmental and cultural processes in the past. Based on climatic units, we have to differentiate the circum-Mediterranean region from the inland Levant as well as from North and South Mesopotamia, Central Anatolia, and the transitional zones in between. We all know the importance of water resources in the Near East, and under certain circumstances, these may be transferred also into the past. Certain knowledge about the terrestrial water balance can be expected from ancient humans, at least since early historic times, probably even earlier. The terrestrial water balance can vary considerably in the different regions of the Near East, depending on the relief and landform configuration, the geological substrate, local evaporation loss, size of drainage area of surface waters, vegetation density, and soil characteristics. These parameters are determining on their part the different types of rivers. Large rivers like the Euphrates usually obtain their water supply from more humid areas or in mountainous regions. Permanence of the water balance is an important agronomic advantage in these regions. Rivers of karstic origin are usually also permanent. Shorter rivers often show a seasonal rhythm in close affinity to precipitation. They are of periodic nature. In areas with open and degraded vegetation, the water surface flow is increased, leading to increased soil erosion. In such areas, the valley plains are dry shortly after the rainy season. Inundation is also frequent. Wadis are characteristic for an episodic regime. In general, in all semi-subarid and arid climate regions, episodic discharge is increasing. Sometimes there is no visible water flow in the wadis due to reduced precipitation for several years. In this case, the hydrological activity is reduced to the groundwater flow, In such areas, the groundwater is pumped, causing the well-known problems of water shortage and drought. This and the next slide show some differences in river discharge in the upper and lower Euphrates and the Kabur, two major rivers of Upper and Lower Mesopotamia. With 2,800 kilometers in length, the Euphrates originates in eastern Turkey and runs all the way through Syria and Iraq. The smaller Kabur River originates also in Turkey, but is mainly fed by karstic springs, runs through Upper Syria to enter the Euphrates. In the lower Kabur region, it often runs dry, which results in major water shortages. Archaeological excavations and survey revealed enormous fluctuation of water discharge in the past, including shifts of the riverbeds, which altogether strongly influenced past settlement activity and dynamics in the different regions. Human development from the end of the Pleistocene into the Holocene has been frequently discussed in relation with climate development. The Near East is well known for its high climatic diversity within small distances. To fully understand these highly diverse regional climatic differences, we need to consider some basic characteristics of weather and climate effects. So, starting from the primary definition of climate as a sum of meteorological phenomena representing the mean conditions of the atmosphere, we can differentiate short-term weather conditions from long-term mean atmospheric conditions, which we call climate. The spatial relationships define whether we deal with macroclimatic conditions or local climatic conditions, the latter of which we usually consider when investigating archaeological remains. The geographic components of the climate are important because they determine the variability of climate effects. The geographic latitudes determines the temperatures because the sun energy at the poles needs to heat up a relatively larger surface than at the equator, which is responsible for the strong temperature differences between, for example, the northern and southern Levantine climates. The position of a location in relation to the sea defines the strength of seasonal fluctuations. Ground cover also plays a role for warming, and elevation and relief determine temperatures and precipitation patterns, such that the windward sides of mountains experience more precipitation than the lee sides, what we see in the west-east decline from coastal Israel to Jordan. There are different climate classifications that, however, are describing similar characteristics. Here you see the classification after Neve based on general atmospheric circulation. The climate diagrams nicely reflect these three climate zones with their prevalent winter rainfall patterns. Having a look at the different regions, we also recognize the strong difference between inland and the coastal areas. Higher elevations inland, like the Taurus Mountains, receive relatively high amounts of precipitation. In this slide, you can nicely recognize the north-south and west-east decline in aridity in the Levant. An important factor in Mediterranean and Near Eastern environments is the high variability of the mean annual precipitation. In a north-south profile, the interannual variability increases from 15% in the north to more than 50% in the south. This results in considerable fluctuations of agricultural yields. Syria is generally characterized by low mean annual precipitation, but in particular through strong interannual fluctuations. The red zone marks the so-called zone of uncertainty according to Wilkinson, and is an area which is often affected by crop failure. Landscape development through anthropogenic impact differs considerably depending on the climate regime under which it appears. In Central Europe, anthropogenic impact since the Neolithic started the opening process of woodland vegetation, leading to the development of synanthropic vegetation, the so-called cultural landscape. There are diverse traditional forms of woodland use that probably also existed in the past, such as coppice, pasture woodland, or timber forest. These diverse use forms led to increased biodiversity, which today is decreasing again with the abandonment of traditional forms of land use. The use of fire in landscape management is often recognized by considerable amounts of microcharcoal in pollen diagrams. If formerly cultivated units were left as wasteland, forest could regenerate, which differs from Mediterranean landscapes where regeneration is usually limited. The age of typical Mediterranean maquis vegetation is an ongoing matter of debate, although it is clear that with increased animal husbandry, browsing left its traces in the landscape. The slide shows the steps of increasing degradation in a Mediterranean landscape through anthropogenic impact. It also shows that the more advanced degradation is, the lower is the chance for regeneration. As for the general global background pattern, we need to shortly look at different climate forcings without going into details. There are at least 3 different types of forcings determining climate on Earth. They act on the different timescales and thus either amplify, extenuate, or modify each other. These are orbital forcing, that is, climate fluctuations in a range of thousands of years, solar forcing with a variability in a range of centuries, and volcanic forcing occurring with a variability over 1 to 10 years. In bringing these different forces with their individual timescales together, general circulation models play an important role and help in the understanding how the different factors are related and how they led to the observed changes throughout the Earth's history. Milutin Milankovic, the originator of the astronomic theory of climate change, discovered that the emergence of ice ages is partially caused by changes of orbital and axial parameters leading to variation of the incoming solar energy. Because the Earth's orbit is elliptical, the Earth's sun distance varies throughout the year. The shape of the orbit, that is how flat the ellipse is, also named its eccentricity, varies in a cycle of 96,000 years. The tilt of the Earth's axis, that is the obliquity, is responsible for the seasons in the higher latitudes. It varies in a cycle of 41,000 years and modifies the amount of solar energy that reaches the different latitudes within this cycle. Independent from eccentricity and obliquity, the axis describes a circular path over 21,700 years. The effect is a temporal change of the path throughout the seasons in relation to the positions of the Earth on the orbit. The change of obliquity determines the extremes of our seasons. A larger tilt of the Earth's axis means more extreme seasons, that is, cooler winters and hotter summers. A smaller tilt means less extreme seasons, that is, cooler summers and milder winters. And it also means that polar regions receive less sunlight. As cool summers are responsible for accumulation of snow and ice in higher latitudes, This effect is responsible for an ice age, whereas a maximum tilt increases the melting of polar ice sheets. The combination of all the three cycles, which you can see in the green curve below, shows a quite good correlation with the Earth's climate, measured in the ice volume over time, visible in the red curve. Radiation of the sun is another climate factor. Sunspots are locally cooler zones on the sun's surface. They appear with a general activity increase of the sun, probably related to reorganization of the sun surface. As there is correlation between the number of sunspots and temperature fluctuations on Earth, it is relevant to global warming. The reconstructed sunspot number from delta 14c correlates to temperature fluctuations on Earth throughout the last millennia, and according to Solanki, we are currently in a similar state of sun activity as 8,000 years ago. This diagram shows the balance between the solar radiation absorbed at the ground in blue and the outgoing infrared radiation from Earth into space in red. The two curves must balance completely over the entire globe, but not at every single latitude. In the tropics, there is an excess of radiation, that is, solar radiation absorbed exceeds outgoing terrestrial radiation. In middle and high latitudes, all the way to the poles, there is a deficit, that is, the Earth is radiating into space more than it receives from the sun. The atmosphere and ocean systems are forced to move about by this imbalance and bring heat by convection and advection from equator to the poles. Here we see the general circulation of the atmosphere in a highly simplified schematic diagram. The main feature is that there are three cells, the Hadley cell, the Ferrel cell, and the polar cell in each hemisphere. Because the Earth rotates, the wind system appears to be somewhat more complex than in this scheme. In the northern hemisphere, between 0 and 30 degrees, the tropical prevailing winds are easterlies, that is, northeastern winds, also called trade winds. In the mid-latitudes, roughly between 30 and 60 degrees, the prevailing winds are westerlies, southwest winds. The polar regions' prevailing winds are easterlies. The wind system in the southern hemisphere is like the mirror image of the northern hemisphere. There are two different effects discussed with volcanic forcing: warming of the stratosphere and cooling of the troposphere. The maximum of temperature deviation in the stratosphere is usually related to major eruptions. Short-term cooling of the troposphere appears through the aerosols, that is, the sulfur dioxide, which are generated by an eruption and reduce the incoming radiation energy. These cooling effects are in a time range of 1 to 10 years. Climatologists suggest that explosive volcanism together with solar forcing are most responsible for climate variability throughout the last 1,000 years. Paleoclimatologists and archaeologists make use of stable isotopes to reconstruct ancient climate. Most paleoclimate records of the last 10 years derive from stable isotope analysis. We will not go into details as these will be treated in the archaeometry courses, but we should at least mention the major paleoclimate archives and some basic aspects of stable isotope analysis as they relate to interdisciplinary studies on ancient agriculture. Aside the exception of 20 pure elements, all elements occur as natural isotope mixtures. The mixing ratio of isotopes of an element is globally more or less the same. Generally, the light isotope is much more frequent as the heavy isotope. Biological and chemical reactions lead to fractionation of the isotope mixture, that is, enrichment or depletion of the heavy isotopes. The relation of the isotope ratio to the standard under normal condition informs us about the conditions during the emergence of that ratio of heavy to light isotopes. For example, because the lighter 16O isotopes evaporate faster, we can use the ratio of 18O to 16O to estimate the mean temperatures. An increase of the 18O to 16O ratio in an ice core is therefore a signal for warming conditions, whereas depletion of 18O indicates cooling. This does not apply to speleothems, which mainly occur in geographic latitudes of minor temperature fluctuations. Here, enrichment of rainwater with 18O is related to rainfall. Because the heavy isotopes precipitate faster, increased 18O concentrations indicate drier and depleted 18O values moister conditions in speleothem environments. Enrichment of 18O in paleoclimate proxy archives can therefore either be a signal of warmer or drier conditions in the past. Depletion accordingly indicates either cooler or moister conditions, depending on the geographic region and the type of archive where the measurements are conducted. The development of glaciers is central to paleoclimate research because it is directly related to the development of paleotemperatures. These in turn are important for vegetation zones, determining the range of activity of humans and animals. The depth of the Greenland ice is several thousand meters. The longest ice corings are more than 3 kilometers long. Dating of ice cores can partially be realized by counting annual strata. Because the accumulation of ice is subject to annual fluctuation, there are annual deposits similar to the varvae in lakes. The visibility of the deposits is, however, restricted, mainly due to movements of ice masses. Focusing on the climate development at the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, we recognize, for example, in the GISP2 ice core of the constitutive Greenland ice sheet project, how minor the fluctuations during the Holocene appear in comparison with the earlier periods. The fluctuations during the Holocene, however, had a considerable impact on the development of human societies. With the end of the last glacial and the first warm phase, the Bölling-Allerød sequence between 13,500 and 13,000 BP, another cold period, followed between 13,000 and 11,500 BP, the Younger Dryas, which is discussed in Near Eastern archaeology mainly in relation with the development of Neolithic societies. After this, there have been other smaller climate fluctuations, the so-called Bond events, which have been investigated by Gerard Bond and his team during the last decades. In sum, Bond discovered 8 climate fluctuations in the Holocene by investigating petrological indicators in ice cores. They occur more or less regularly in a cycle of roughly 1,500 years. Many of these global cooling events have been discussed in relation with cultural transition periods. Mainly the 8,200 and the 4,200 BP events have been vividly discussed in archaeology during the last decades. There are only a couple of well-investigated sequences from lake sediments in Anatolia and the Near East. namely Lake Van in southeastern Anatolia and Lake Seribar in Iran. Like in ice cores, there are annual deposits in lakes, so-called varvae, but with a better visibility compared to ice cores. They evolve through seasonal differences of sediment deposition. In spring and summer, melting waters of the glaciers deposit light, sandy sediments. In winter, dark clays, rich in humus, are deposited. Depending on precipitation and temperature, these deposits are more or less thick. When interpreting the isotopic ratios originating from different object types, we need to be aware that they experience different processes of fractionation. Generally, isotopes from lacustrine sediments are more difficult to interpret than those from ice cores, because lacustrine systems are much more complex. Different water types of different origin and varying chemical composition may be flowing into a lake. Each lake has its own system, which makes comparisons between different lakes extremely difficult. Lake Van, or Van Gölü, is the largest lake in Turkey in the southeast of the country. It is supplied by numerous rivers of the surrounding mountains, but has no outflow. Therefore, it is a salt lake. Since several decades, numerous coring projects are conducted there. The Younger Dryas and the increase in aridity are well recognizable in the delta 18O values and partially also in the palynological record. Speleothems are stalactites or stalagmites in caves. As with the other proxies, we recognize depositional layers in the speleothems which can be dated, generally with urantorium, although this results in a large standard deviation. First, paleoclimatological investigations on speleothems have been conducted in the end of the 1960s. In the Near East, the most frequently cited record is that of Sorek Cave near Jerusalem, investigated by Bar Matthews and colleagues. Several of the peaks in the carbon, but also in particular in the oxygen-stable isotope curves, agree with the Bond events and have been used in the interpretation of major cultural transition phases, such as the 8.2 BP, the 5.2 BP and the 4.2 BP events. Starting with Gordon Childe, climate change has often been considered an important factor in the emergence of agriculture. One of the most popular ideas was that the favorable conditions at the beginning of the Holocene led to population growth, while the increased aridity during the Younger Dryas resulted in population pressure and forced humans into agriculture. The debate is ongoing. The best-known paleoclimate archives in the Fertile Crescent that have been basic in interpreting the Pleistocene-Holocene transition in this area are the pollen records from Lake Van, Kaap Valley, Lake Hule, and Lake Seribar, as well as the oxygen isotope record from the speleothems in Sorek Cave and from the lake sediments of Van. Pollen cores have also been acquired from the eastern Mediterranean Sea. It is, however, important to realize that the Younger Dryas fluctuations and the vegetation development in the Near East differed regionally. Ecological indicator species that have been used in the Mediterranean pollen cores are Chenopodiaceae, indicative of dry steppes and semi-desert environments. They also contain many salt-tolerant species and can also occur in later contexts as background flora under irrigation or in coastal regions. The pistachio is a typical indicator of warm and dry climates. Artemisia is usually found in dry semi-desert environments, oak in warm climates with more than 550 mm mean annual precipitation. The general pollen record is in good agreement with climatic developments at the end of the Pleistocene. The dominance of Artemisia and Chenopodiaceae in the first half of the Younger Dryas corresponds well with the dry and cold climate, followed by an increase of oak toward the end of the Younger Dryas, continuing into the Holocene climate optimum with an increased presence of pistachio. The chronological interpretation of older pollen diagrams is problematic. In the 1970s, radiocarbon dating on pollen cores was rarely conducted. This led to a series of controversial publications on the dating of the different pollen zones. Here the example of the Hule pollen diagram originally published by Baruch and Botemer. According to the dating, the Younger Dryas would be placed with the declining arboreal pollen. Later, Rossignol's trick shifted the position of the Younger Dryas downward in the diagram on the basis of chronostratigraphy, which she concluded in her work with deep-sea cores from the eastern Mediterranean Sea. This was considered appropriate because the radiocarbon dates from Hule were discussed to be biased due to reservoir effects. Some years later, Wright provided a sequence for the Younger Dryas, which would characterize it as a weak climate impact in comparison to the Zagros area, but which was oriented at the original publication. Oak values never fall below 20%, and even in the Younger Dryas, oak seems to be presented with high values. In 2006, Robinson and colleagues again used the chronology provided by Rossignol's trick, and in 2009, Van Zeist and colleagues set the whole diagram into the Holocene, and the section that formerly had been classified as Younger Dryas was now the later Neolithic period. In fact, we still do not have very well dated pollen diagrams from these areas, which has even been impeded during the last decades due to political upheaval and war in Near Eastern countries. Let's now consider the archaeobotanical outcome of pre-Holocene archaeological sites in the Near East. A few Paleolithic sites have been intensively studied for their plant remains. Some of them have already been mentioned by Gerlinde Bigger in her lecture on Paleolithic archaeobotany. They comprise the Acheulean site of Gesher Benod Yakov, the Upper Paleolithic Kebara and Amud caves, and the Epipaleolithic waterlogged site of Ohalutu, all in Israel, and the Middle Paleolithic Shanidar cave in Iraq. There have been more during the last decades, but we will only consider these 5 archaeologically well-studied sites for now. Recent archaeological evidence demonstrated that a broad spectrum of plant resources has been used from at least the late Middle Paleolithic onward, probably starting even in the Lower Paleolithic. That there are only few of such records of plant use may be of taphonomic reasons. The Acheulean site of Gesher Benod Yakov, which dates to about 70–50,000 BP, preserved legumes, grape and olive remains, which may have been gathered by Middle Paleolithic hunters and gatherers. The plant remains that have been dated show ages of around 40,000 BP. Middle Paleolithic humans in Amud and Kebara caves in Israel are also known to have systematically gathered plant resources. In the case of Kebara cave, lentil and other pulses, as well as acorns and pistachio besides of many other species, were used. The findings at Shanida Cave in Iraq are most famous for the pollen remains from the site that have been interpreted as indicating ritual funerals and the deposition of flowers. The site has been excavated in the 1950s by Ralf Solecki, and during these campaigns 9 Neanderthal skeletons have been found. In 2014, excavations continued under the leadership of Graham Barker and others from the University of Cambridge. During these, 3 more Neanderthal skeletons have been excavated. The skeleton number 4, with a maximum age of 60,000 years, has been found as a crouched inhumation inside the cave and was of a 30 to 45-year-old male individual. The sediments around the skeleton have been sampled for pollen analysis by Leroy-Gourand. Based on the identification of a large amount of flowering plants, many of which are from the Asteraceae family, the context was interpreted to represent the bedding of the dead on these plants, gathered by others of the group in the environments of the cave. More recent pollen studies on the site, however, show that the pollen assemblage is a very typical one for cave sites, having a major overrepresentation of pollen from the Asteraceae family. The authors emphasize the general taphonomic issues of cave sites, well known to palynologists. These are bad preservation due to the presence of oxygen and major transfer of modern pollen into the sediments by insects and small mammals. Therefore, they question the earlier interpretations. Independent of this, it cannot be excluded that the ancient humans did make use of plants for various purposes. Support to this argument is provided by the analysis of starch remains. Teeth of the Neanderthal people at Shanida III, dating to about 44,000 BP, have been studied, and starch grains included in dental calculus were identified to represent barley starch, suggesting that the Shanida people were collecting and consuming Hordeum spontaneum, which is abundant at the site today. I will not comment on this interpretation, but would like to remind you to one of our earlier sessions on starch grain identification. As already mentioned, Middle Paleolithic Amud Cave, northwest of the Sea of Galilee, is well known for its human remains, which brought important evidence of the diversification and development of Middle Eastern Neanderthals. The site has been dated to 45 to 47,000 years BP. The numerous human remains represent at least 16 specimens, while 2/3 of them are children or infants. The Neanderthal specimens show a stronger affinity to the Shanidar Neanderthals rather than to classic European Neanderthals. The study of phytoliths from the site show that the Amud Neanderthals emphasized both wood and grass exploitation. Ligneous parts of trees and shrubs were used mainly for fuel. Herbaceous plants were used for bedding, possibly fuel, and for food. There is clear and repetitive evidence for the exploitation of mature grass panicles, inferred to have been collected for their seeds. These findings suggest that a broad spectrum of plants has been exploited from at least the end of the Middle Paleolithic. The Middle Paleolithic cave site of Kebara in northern Israel dates between 60,000 to 83,000 BP. Part of a Neanderthal skeleton probably represents a burial. 900 liters of sediment deriving from 120 cubic meters have been floated for archaeobotanical remains. The samples have been systematically taken and contained lots of carbonized plant remains, mostly close to the fireplaces. About 4,200 carbonized seeds and fruits have been recovered, and the find density is with 5 seeds per liter sediment very high for such an early site. 78% represented pulses and were probably intended for consumption. Seasonality of available plants point to a use of the cave in April to June. Another short stay is likely for autumn, indicated by few finds of acorn and pistachio. The most ancient evidence for cultivation of wild cereals by anatomically modern humans derives from the Upper Paleolithic site of Ohalu II at about 23,000 BP, within the late glacial maximum, ascribed to the Kebara culture. 2,000 square meters have been excavated. The remains are extraordinarily well preserved through vast coverage by lake sediments. In the 3x4 meter large hut outline, 60,000 plant remains have been found, representing almost 100 taxa. Distinct differences in find density could be elaborated thanks to a systematic sampling strategy. Wild grasses and other wild plant taxa were concentrated around the grinding stone. High concentration of Chinellia, a small grass species in the southern area of the hut, was interpreted as matting. On the basis of the plant distribution, 2 activity zones were reconstructed. In the north, food preparation with the grinding stone was conducted. In the south, silices have been produced. Please note the hidden interpretation of gender-determined work sharing in this reconstruction.